I think this
I would like to begin by thanking the organizing committee, pulling off an international meeting in the best of
okay.
times.
The sounds now come on, so
So done
we
so
will
during
start
a
again.
global pandemic, well, the organizers should receive some sort of award for what they've accomplished. Thanks to you all. What data would change the mind of a bigot or a climate change denier to make them think otherwise? We must come to terms with the overwhelming empirical evidence concerning how cultural and political beliefs filter the facts we choose to see and acknowledge. Traditional liberal political theories continue to advocate the idea that good old-fashioned, well-reasoned talk holds the potential to solve any ill. How can that be if we hear only what we want? We have a term for this, motivated reasoning. Rather than using facts to objectively arrive at a political decision, or any decision, really, this framework argues that we rationalize our way into decisions we originally wanted to make. This occurs thanks to both confirmation bias, a tendency to look only for information we agree with, and disconfirmation bias, which involves systematically dismissing information that we disagree with. These biases are also especially strongly correlated with partisanship. This explains the tendency to reduce debates to being about left versus right on the political spectrum, whether talking about climate change, COVID-19, mask wearing, or whether Black Lives Matter. The more we identify with a political party, the more we work to find ways to have our beliefs confirmed. In one study, authors analyzed climate change survey data from 3 populations: the US public, scientists actively publishing on energy technologies, and congressional policy advisors. Its findings uncovered, quote, evidence that the ideological divide about global warming gets significantly larger according to respondents' knowledge about politics, energy, and science, unquote. More knowledge, in other words, was shown to increase the divide between climate change skeptics and those believing it to be real and human-induced. Strategies forward need to be informed by these realizations. Drawing from more than a dozen social experiments and a number of natural ones, which I've conducted and observed over the last decade, my lecture today outlines the thesis of a forthcoming book with Stanford University Press. The book unpacks those experiences that touched participants so deeply that some of those cognitive filters changed. In other instances, I show how partisan motivated reasoning was leveraged to enroll participation of the very individuals you would expect to be least interested in fostering empathy toward historically marginalized groups. Some experiments described even providing clues about when facts are more likely to matter, but only after individuals were primed by those embodied encounters. Why food? As opposed to creating encounters with the expressed purpose of coming together to hash out differences, which generally results in people becoming immediately defensive, food has a disarming quality. When you come into a space because of food, or to learn about food and or food systems, we generally do so in a way that elicits different attitudes and outlooks than if the encounter is explicitly about confronting something as uncomfortable as social otherness, incivility, and hate. In short, not only are most people generally open to learning more about food, but they also tend to do so in a way that makes them open to other encounters, which creates interesting openings for understanding and compassion for otherwise socially othered groups. Why now? As opposed to, looking at national polling data from 2018, 69% believe we have a major civility problem in the United States. Hate groups are active at an all-time level, not only in my own country, but in other countries too. The American Psychological Association cites the current political climate as a major stressor for their members' clients. Among Generation Z adults, 69% feel very or somewhat stressed about our national future, with 55% calling out specifically the political environment as a source of discomfort and stress. It is such a mess out there that I am reluctant to call what we are seeing incivility, which seems tame. People can fight, and friends can fight, but this seems much, much worse. Looking at what we are facing, mass shootings, some intentionally targeting immigrant communities, pipe bombs being mailed to politicians, chants of "send her back" directed at Somali-born congresswoman here in the United States, teens being physically assaulted for their choice of political apparel, misogyny, sexism. The list goes on and on. The why now question ought to be obvious. One strategy growing in popularity for restoring stability to our politics is professionally facilitated conversations. I've attended dozens of these where people with divergent outlooks and political beliefs gather and talk it out. The problem with this solution is that the conversations are designed for those already willing to jump headlong into the uncertain. Inspiring stories come from these events where self-proclaimed enemies become friends, but that only happens when both sides open themselves to the possibility. And there is the rub. These events are aimed principally at tackling incivility among individuals who can already demonstrate a level of civility and respect to those confronted. What makes people want to participate in these events in the first place? That is the unasked question we need to be finding answers to. To answer this question, I've been conducting, for lack of a better word, social experiments, which includes observing some natural ones too, for the better part of 10 years, ranging from having people on the political right participate in what's colloquially known as food stamp challenges for weeks on end, living, in other words, on a food budget dictated by government food stamp allocations. I conducted an 8-year longitudinal study of people working off part of their subscription to a CSA, which brought together people of different races, classes, nationalities, and sexual orientations with very interesting effects. I had people spend days picking berries and detasseling corn to see how these experiences impacted their views of immigrant laborers and conventional ag producers, respectively. I brought progressive urban foodies to wild game dinners where they ate wild game with conservative rural gun enthusiasts. I also detailed my experiences building rural-urban linkages in Colorado while working to connect Denver's urban food plan with rural communities and rural food producers from around the state. I will focus the remainder of my time on one of my experiments and try to ethnographically detail the factors that shape the role of affect, embodiment, and practice in shaping our moral geographies, which is to say our beliefs about how the world is and ought to be, which has profound consequences in how we think about things, people, food, politics, and the like. To do this, however, I want to present my data a bit differently than is typical for a research presentation. If my thesis is that we've gotten our priorities mixed up in terms of how we understand not only politics, but also how we think about human behavior and attitudes, namely that what we do and think is less about what we're told and more about how we feel and experience the world, then it would be truly foolish of me to be here today and spout off facts and data devoid of the experiences themselves. And so, following the writer's maxim about the importance of showing the reader rather than telling them, I've decided to incorporate some ethnographic elements into this lecture as well, which will involve me trying to show you with words the experiences themselves. So for this study, I recruited 31 individuals who were identified by reaching out to contacts in the state of California, friends of friends, and in some cases, friends of friends of friends. The aim was to enlist individuals who were, as I had described them, quote, pro-wall and anti-immigration, the more so, the better, unquote. Is there a way to make more visible the bodies that populate our food system, practices with the potential to instill empathy within eaters toward those who feed us? Having rented a U-pick berry farm for a day, I put those 31 individuals to work to see how the experience might have impacted them in terms of their feelings toward otherwise invisible immigrants who pick our strawberries and raspberries. I rented out the strawberry portion of the U-pick for the morning, taking over the farm's raspberry beds in the afternoon. Participants were told to come covered up, long pants and sleeves, something for the head, and if they had them, work boots, all to mimic the dress of the industrial berry picker. They were also instructed on how laborers pick to maximize their productivity. Strawberries, from what I've been told by those in the industry, require a particular technique, legs slightly spread, bent at the waist like a runner frozen mid-floor stretch. This frees both hands for the pick. I was not able to discern an industry-wide style for picking raspberries, so participants were given more leeway for that fruit as long as they worked fast. Realizing that water breaks are a luxury for immigrant laborers, participants were also discouraged from spending too much time at the water cooler. Participants were instructed to use the mobile devices to capture images of their time picking. I was especially interested in seeing if and how the photos changed during the course of the day, to see, in other words, if the experience's physicality would imprint itself into the images. The photos yielded some interesting data. The day started with the group taking countless landscape images, plus a number of selfies. A few individuals even displayed some talent. Most of the pictures looked like they could have been on a postcard. You know, the type where the beauty is eulogized and there's not much personal insight on the image. But what I found really interesting is that by afternoon, the pictures took on a different character. By afternoon, exertion became the muse, and sweat, stains, and dirt took over as the center of interest, as illustrated by this picture, and there are others that were representative of this as well. Participants were interviewed twice, roughly 1 week before and 1 week after the experience. The first to establish an attitudinal baseline, and the second to see if that baseline had moved. Additional data were collected by asking participants to complete a brief survey, again, once before and once after. In this particular survey, I drew inspiration from one designed by a team of researchers in Belgium who were measuring attitudes toward immigration there. And as you can see, the questions here get at their views about what they think are quote-unquote good immigrants, looking at issues related to the languages they speak, the color of their skin, their educational qualities, and the like. Give you a moment to look that over. In the next slide. So this figure depicts the average score for all 5 questions at both points in time, before and after field work. My initial directive was to only enroll pro-wall and anti-immigration participants, and it looks like the mission was accomplished. The figure also makes clear that this group was not dead set against immigration per se. They had few qualms with immigrants who were privileged, English-speaking and white. Also clear from the figures the fact that these attitudes can and did change. I tried something new for this experiment, triangulating web analytics with the other data. Specifically, a website was created and populated with information about industrial berry production, with particular attention placed on labor practices. The site was populated by secondary data gleaned from government and non-government agencies, links to relevant documentaries and video clips, and news articles. An email was sent to all participants immediately after receiving their consent to participate. In addition to containing information about what laid ahead, the message directed them to that website. Quote, for those wanting background information on industrial strawberry and raspberry production, please give this website a look, unquote, they were instructed. A few days before our second interview, participants were sent another email and reminded about the website. Behind the scenes, I was monitoring traffic onto the site and tracked navigation through it. As it could only be accessed by the hot link, I could be confident that those visiting had been invited to do so. And when they were interviewed, I confirmed that the link had not been shared. Two of the 31 participants clicked on the link when it was first sent, with only one navigating past the home page. Evidence of motivated reasoning, I would argue. But when emailed the link for a second time, after their time in the field, 20 participants clicked through, a 900% increase, and of those, all navigated past the home page. Now, I never said information has no role to play in our politics. Facts remain a powerful force for changing hearts and minds, as long as those hearts and minds have already been primed for change. Engagements that get people to open up, to accept exposure to data that might challenge and upset established beliefs is what we ought to be creating. The question I was interested in answering with the web analytics was, did the experiment make people want to learn about industrial berry production? The answer to that question appears to be an unqualified yes, based on the data described. But not only that, the information on the website appears to have eventually pierced through participants' cognitive filters. I know this because some parroted facts listed on the website during our second interview, such as names of top producing US states and countries for strawberry production, pesticides recently banned by the European Union, and rates of pesticide poisoning among laborers. Turns out we can change people's minds with the help of a little nudge from their bodies. Now to showing you some data, introduce you to Ralph, who is a white racist, to speak frank. I first met Ralph, a giant of a man, at a cafe less than a 20-minute drive from what he would later describe on more than one occasion as the U-pick from hell. He arrived early to this meeting spot with his two teenage children. When I showed up, they were playing checkers. He was supervising all 6 feet 10 inches of them, occasionally offering advice. A surly-looking fella in green fatigues, he cut an imposing figure. Leaving the kids to their game, we retreated to a private room that I had reserved. It was 2018, and the immigration issue was all over the news and social media. Ralph seemed eager to talk about border security. Quote, it's a crisis. We can't stop them coming over. Those that are here are taking welfare and jobs. We need to look after our own first, unquote. The them and those he was referring to are immigrants, though he never fully clarified if he was referring to only the undocumented ones. Not that an immigrant's legal status likely mattered to him. He seemed most concerned about where individuals immigrated from. The first interview with Ralph was uncomfortable, one of the most uncomfortable of my career. The first time he used a derogatory term to describe Mexicans, I asked him, politely but firmly, to choose his words more carefully in the future when in my presence. I did not wish to hear any more of that rhetoric or risk having the nearby kids hear it, at least not on my watch. His feelings were abundantly clear with that one remark. Additional would not have added any further insight. That intervention did not stop him from expressing his disdain toward this group, though he did do a better job minding his P's and Q's from that point. The experience ultimately heightened my interest in Ralph during the day of the pick, mostly out of a sense of caution. The day started with me laying out some ground rules like being respectful of others and only using language appropriate around elementary school children. I did not want Ralph or anyone hijacking the day by saying or doing something inappropriate. Don't get me wrong, I was glad to have Ralph there with us. If these experiments cannot touch the Ralphs of the world, then what's the point? Ralph showed up early, looking the part. He had on a long-sleeve flannel shirt, gray Carhartt pants, and a bandana wrapped atop his head. Not long after arriving, he made friends with a gentleman over coffee and pastries. They both had spent an extended period of time in Germany and used the occasion to reminisce. All that banter did nothing to slow Ralph's strawberry picking pace. He easily outperformed the others, close to double the average of the group. When complimented on his strawberry picking skills, he absently remarked, "Nothing to it." While he did not say it, he was clearly proud of his picking prowess. Over lunch, he used the accomplishment to remind me of his disdain toward immigrants. Quote, "If someone my size can handle this, I think it would be a walk in the park for some little Hispanic half my size," unquote. Then came the afternoon. The day was very warm. The weather app on my phone read 92 degrees. I did not know the exact temperature under those raspberry tunnels, though the sweat dripping off my nose gave me an idea of what it could have been. We were about an hour into the afternoon pick when I heard Ralph call out, "Permission to take my shirt off, boss." He was looking at me. I had watched enough movies depicting prison labor to get the reference. It's a term used often in those films. Not that he was suggesting that this was a prison and that I a guard. He said it in a friendly enough manner. I also know that hierarchical individualists, those who value stratification and who expect individuals to secure their own well-being, generally expect situations to be governed by someone in a position of authority. Ralph, a white, male, registered Republican, checked all the right boxes for being a hierarchical individualist. I know enough about them to know one when I hear one. His comments about people needing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and about how, quote, "the poor are poor for a reason," unquote, held a hallmark of someone harboring that particular value set. And me, being another white male with a track record of putting him in his place, no doubt had something to do with him placing me as that person of authority. Affirming his request with a nod, he took off his shirt. He then turned, revealing a large Celtic cross across his back, a symbol I know to be used in some white nationalist circles. It was clear that the heat and exertion was making Ralph uncomfortable. The shirt started off blue, but by afternoon it had turned violet, almost black from the perspiration. Any comfort gained by going shirtless proved to be short-lived. Less than 5 minutes had passed since granting his request before he blurted out, "Shit, damn it." A body the size of Ralph's is hard to navigate in the confines of a raspberry tunnel, and he was truly uncomfortable. And he told me so during our second interview. We did reunite about a week later at the same cafe we had met prior. When asked during the first interview if he looked at the website created for the experiment, he glibly answered with a chuckle, "Yeah, no, didn't have time." He did look, however, prior to our second meeting at the cafe. This itself is not an earth-shattering behavioral change, if you can even describe it in those terms. It is not the act, the click, that interests me, but that he voluntarily recited information from the website during that second interview. Quote, "Almost all of the strawberries produced in the US come from California, with Florida in a distant second place," unquote. He was also able to enumerate pesticide poisoning rates. Quote, "Almost 200,000 people die every year from self-poisoning." Self-poisoning? I assume that's a nice way of saying suicide, unquote. That too came from that website. The World Health Organization places the figure at 170,000 self-poisoned pesticide deaths annually. He had not just visited the website, he studied it. Noting this observation, I asked why. He looked almost embarrassed, hesitant maybe. I can't quite explain what I saw in his face other than to say it was not a look I had expected to see on this overly confident, imposing man. Quote, "Call it a case of curiosity," he told me, adding, "Maybe I wanted to learn something. Let's leave it at that." Here was a case of a man who neither cared about immigrants nor wanted to learn about their plight as immigrants when we first met. During our first interview, he in fact told me that, quote, "Those figures that tell how bad immigrants have it is all fake news," unquote. But by the second interview, something changed. He started to express interest in their livelihoods and their experiences as immigrants, as evidenced by his newfound willingness to look at that website, memorize the facts there, which were previously described as fake, and by what he told me, have a genuine change of heart. While I certainly will not say he has fully come around to the plight of socially marginalized groups by any stretch of the imagination, he is further along that path now than he was before the experiment. To be clear, I'm not suggesting I found a solution to what is troubling the world today. Take these findings as opening new doors for empirical investigation, as generating, in other words, new research questions. Who doesn't know the virtues of empathy? It's embedded in every major world religion. And yet, our empathy for poor and the socially othered groups around the world is still terribly lacking. So what are we to do? Well, I would argue we need to think big by, wait for it, going small. Only through the quotidian and mundane can we hope to circumvent those filters. We need to change practices if we hope to change attitudes. I acknowledge that the focus of my forthcoming book is on human others, a focus that I've justified and explained. But I do think there are some lessons to be learned through this research for dealing with issues related to non-human animals, climate change, and the like. There's something deeply amiss with how humans engage with other humans and how we interact with the world. After all, it's humans who are denying climate change, not non-human animals. And because of that, the whole world burns. So you could say that through this research, I'm also trying to address some of the fundamental first principles that are not only responsible for placing such strain on democratic institutions around the world, but that are also responsible for grave environmental injustices. In other words, I'm not convinced we can solve today's environmental crises without first addressing those fundamental social, political, and cultural crises, which I'm trying to make sense of through this research by investigating the roles of effect, embodiment, and practice. To get there, we need to abandon the premise that the problem is just a matter of differing opinions, disagreements that can be fixed with more and better knowledge and education. With so many steadfast in their belief that they are on the right side of history and just plain right in their convictions, it is foolish to think any meaningful encounters can be had where the expressed purpose is acknowledging we are wrong while admitting the true claim of others. This also explains my fascination with food. It can both motivate and disarm, creating a potential entry point to understanding without participants even knowing it. The aim should not be about telling people to change their convictions. People have to get there by their own choosing. We cannot force people to become empathetic and caring. That will just have the opposite effect, but that's okay. With the opportunities afforded to us by food, all we have to do is leverage that interest and wonderment in ways that create new experiences. That's how we change minds, by changing embodiments. Thank you all so much for this opportunity.